The sound of a gunshot tore through the silence of dawn, jolting Lillian Matthews from her fitful sleep. It wasn't an unusual occurrence in Columbus, New Mexico territory. 1885, not since her husband's gambling debts had forced them to the fringes of town where lawlessness ruled the night. But this morning was different. The cold space beside her in bed confirmed what she already knew. Thomas wasn't coming home. Lillian's trembling fingers traced the simple gold band on her left hand, the last remnant of what had once been a promise of forever. The cupboards were bare, her stomach hollow with 3 days of hunger. Thomas had taken everything else of value before disappearing 2 weeks ago, leaving nothing but his mounting debts behind. She pulled her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders, fighting back tears as she watched the early morning light filter through the cracks in the weathered cabin walls. At 23, Lillian had already experienced more hardship than most faced in a lifetime. Orphaned at 16, married at 18 to a man who'd seemed kind and steady until the gambling fever took hold of him. Now, with winter approaching and no means to survive, desperation had become her only companion. The wedding ring caught the light as she twisted it around her finger. It wasn't worth much. Thomas hadn't been a wealthy man even before the cards and whiskey claimed him, but it might be enough for bread. Enough to survive until she could figure out what came next. Columbus had grown rapidly since the railroad's arrival 3 years prior, transforming from a dusty outpost to a bustling frontier town almost overnight. The saloons and trading posts that lined the main street catered to cowboys, railroad men, and miners passing through. It wasn't a place for a woman alone, but Lillian had run out of choices. The walk from her cabin on the outskirts took nearly an hour, her worn boots offering little protection against the rocky terrain. By the time she reached town, the sun had risen high in the clear blue sky, bringing with it the familiar New Mexico heat that seared through clothing and parched the throat. Patterson's General Store stood at the corner of the main thoroughfare, its painted wooden sign promising fair prices for goods and trade. Lillian had been there only a handful of times, always accompanied by Thomas. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed open the door, the little bell above it announcing her arrival. "Mrs. Matthews," Mr. Patterson greeted her with a nod, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose as he looked up from his ledger. "Don't often see you in town these days." Lillian forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Patterson. I've come to inquire about a trade." The older man's eyebrows rose slightly as Lillian twisted the gold band from her finger and placed it on the counter between them. Its absence felt wrong, like she'd removed a piece of herself. "My wedding ring," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was hoping to trade it for some flour, perhaps some beans, just enough to get by for a while." Patterson's face softened with pity as he picked up the ring, examining it in the light. "I'm sorry to hear things have gotten so difficult, Mrs. Matthews, but I'm afraid this isn't worth much plain gold, no stones." "Please," Lillian said, hating the desperation in her voice. "Anything you can offer would help." The storekeeper sighed, looking uncomfortable. "I could give you a few pounds of flour for it, maybe some coffee. Not much more than that, I'm afraid." Before Lillian could respond, a deep voice spoke from behind her. "The lady won't be selling her ring today, Patterson." Lillian turned to find herself facing a tall man she'd never seen before. Dust from the trail covered his dark clothing, and the shadow of a beard darkened his jaw. His eyes, a startling shade of blue against his sun-weathered skin, held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "This isn't your business, mister," she managed, straightening her spine despite the hunger making her light-headed. "Samuel Davenport," he said by way of introduction, tipping his hat slightly. And I make it my business when I see a woman trying to trade her wedding ring for bread." He turned to the storekeeper. "Mr. Patterson, I'd like 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of beans, coffee, sugar, bacon, and whatever else the lady needs. Put it on my account." Patterson looked between them, clearly relieved. "Right away, Mr. Davenport." "I don't accept charity from strangers," Lillian said quietly, reaching for her ring. "Especially not men I don't know." Samuel Davenport's expression remained steady as he gently closed her fingers around the ring, his calloused hand warm against hers. "Keep it," he said, his voice softening. "You'll need hope more than bread in the long run." Something in his words, or perhaps the kindness in them, brought tears to Lillian's eyes. She blinked them away furiously, unwilling to show weakness. "Why would you help me?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. She'd learned the hard way that men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. "Because I've been hungry before," he answered simply. "And because that ring means something to you, even if its worth in gold is small." Patterson returned with a large burlap sack filled with provisions. "Here you are, Mrs. Matthews. This should last you a good while." Lillian stared at the abundance before her, more food than she'd seen in months, and felt her resolve weakening. "I can't possibly accept this," she said, though her stomach clenched painfully at the thought of refusing. "Consider it a loan, then," Samuel suggested, his voice matter of fact. "I've just purchased the old Miller Ranch outside town. Could use someone to help get the place in order, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. The pay would include room and board, plus enough to settle this debt." Lillian narrowed her eyes, searching for deceit in his expression. "You're offering me work." "I am," he confirmed with a nod. "Nothing improper. The housekeeper's quarters have a separate entrance and the door locks from the inside." It could be a trap, Lillian thought. This stranger could have any number of unsavory intentions. But the alternative was starvation, and something in his steady gaze made her want to trust him. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally. Samuel nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "Of course. I'll be staying at the hotel for the next few days while some repairs are finished at the ranch." "The offer stands until then." He tipped his hat again. "Madam." Lillian watched him leave, the ring clutched tightly in her palm. She slipped it back onto her finger, the familiar weight both comforting and condemning. "He's a good man, Mrs. Matthews," Patterson said quietly as he helped her gather the provisions. "Bought the Miller place for a fair price when nobody else would touch it after what happened there. Plans to raise horses, from what I hear." Lillian recalled the tragedy that had befallen the Millers the previous winter. The entire family lost to influenza within days of each other. The ranch had sat empty since, many claiming it was cursed. "I don't know him," she replied simply. "New to these parts," Patterson confirmed. "Came from Wyoming, I believe. Keeps to himself mostly, but pays his bills and treats folks fair. More than can be said for many." The subtle comparison to Thomas wasn't lost on Lillian. She thanked the storekeeper and made her way back home, the heavy sack of provisions a physical reminder of her encounter with the mysterious cowboy. That night, with a full stomach for the first time in weeks, Lillian sat by the flickering light of a single candle and considered her options. Thomas had been gone long enough that she doubted he'd return, and even if he did, nothing would change. The debts would still be there, along with the empty promises and heartbreak. Samuel Davenport's offer represented something she'd nearly forgotten existed: a choice. Not charity, but honest work. A chance to reclaim some dignity. The following morning, Lillian packed her few belongings into a small trunk. She took one last look at the cabin that had been her home for the past 5 years, a place that had witnessed both her brightest hopes and deepest despairs, before closing the door on that chapter of her life. Columbus was already alive with activity when she arrived, freight wagons and cowboys filling the streets as the town awakened to another day on the frontier. The Columbus Hotel stood 3 stories tall, its whitewashed facade a stark contrast to the dusty road before it. Lillian hesitated at the entrance, smoothing her faded dress and tucking a stray strand of auburn hair back into her simple bun. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, asking the clerk at the front desk for Mr. Davenport. "He's taking breakfast in the dining room, madam," the young man informed her, pointing toward a doorway at the end of the hall. Samuel sat alone by the window, a newspaper spread before him as he sipped his coffee. He looked up as she approached, surprise and then satisfaction crossing his features as he rose to his feet. "Mrs. Matthews," he greeted her, pulling out the chair opposite his. "Please join me." Lillian remained standing, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I've come about the position," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "If it's still available, I'd like to accept." A smile, the first she'd seen from him, transformed his serious face. "I'm glad to hear it. Have you eaten? Let me order you some breakfast while we discuss the details." Before she could protest, he had signaled the waiter and ordered a full breakfast for her. The smell of fresh biscuits and bacon made her mouth water despite her determination to maintain her composure. "The position includes room and board, as I mentioned," Samuel began once the waiter had departed. "Plus $10 a month. The house needs a thorough cleaning. It's been empty for some time, and thereafter the usual duties of keeping it in order, cooking meals and such." "That's generous," Lillian acknowledged, startled by the fair wage. It was more than many men earned for ranch work. Samuel shrugged. "I believe in paying what work is worth, not what I might get away with paying." The waiter returned with a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy. Lillian tried to eat slowly to maintain some dignity, but hunger won out over pride. "There's something else you should know," Samuel said as she finished her meal. "The Miller place has a reputation in town." Lillian nodded. "I've heard. The family died of influenza." "That's the story," he agreed, his expression grave. "But there's more to it. Old man Miller didn't die of sickness. He took his own life after losing his wife and children, shot himself in the bedroom. That's why no one would buy the property. They say it's haunted." A chill ran down Lillian's spine despite the warm dining room. "Do you believe that?" Samuel's blue eyes held her steadily. "I believe a man driven to despair might leave an echo behind, but I don't fear it. The house needs life in it again, not fear." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve the truth before you decide," he replied. "I wouldn't want you staying in a place that frightens you." Lillian considered his words. After everything she'd endured, the possibility of a ghost seemed almost trivial. "I'm not afraid of echoes, Mr. Davenport. I've lived with my own for long enough." Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "Then if you're still willing, we can leave for the ranch this afternoon. I've hired a wagon to transport your belongings and some supplies." "I don't have much," she admitted. "Just one trunk." "Then we'll have room for more supplies," he said simply, with no judgment in his tone. They departed Columbus shortly after noon, the wagon laden with Lillian's modest trunk and numerous crates of household goods. The Miller Ranch, now Davenport's, lay 8 miles outside town, nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance. As they approached, Lillian could see why the property had appealed to Samuel despite its tragic history. A creek ran through the land, feeding a stand of cottonwood trees that provided rare shade in the New Mexico territory. The ranch house itself was substantial, built of adobe with a wide porch wrapping around 2 sides. Several outbuildings, including a large barn and what appeared to be bunkhouses, completed the property. "It's beautiful," Lillian murmured, taking in the sweeping vistas. "It will be," Samuel agreed, bringing the wagon to a halt before the house. "It needs work, but the bones are good. The previous owner built it to last." Up close, the neglect was more apparent. Dust coated every surface, and several window panes had cracked from the elements. The door creaked ominously as Samuel pushed it open, revealing a spacious but gloomy interior. "I've had men working on the roof and chimneys," he explained, leading her through the main rooms. "The kitchen stove is new, arrived last week, and the pump in the kitchen works well. The housekeeper's quarters are through here." He opened a door off the kitchen to reveal a small but pleasant room with its own entrance to the outside. A narrow bed, dresser, and washstand constituted the furnishings. "It's perfect," Lillian said, genuinely pleased with the arrangement. The room was clean and private, more than she dared hope for. "I'll bring your trunk," Samuel offered. "Take some time to settle in. We can discuss the household matters over supper. I brought provisions from town that should see us through until you can make a proper list of what's needed." Left alone, Lillian sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by how quickly her circumstances had changed. Yesterday, she'd been contemplating selling her wedding ring for a few days' worth of food. Today, she had employment, shelter, and the beginnings of independence. She touched the gold band that still encircled her finger. Thomas's ring, the symbol of promises broken. Perhaps it was time to put it away, to acknowledge that chapter had closed. Yet something held her back. Not love that had withered long ago under the weight of disappointment and betrayal, but rather a reluctance to admit defeat, to concede that her marriage had failed. With a sigh, she began unpacking her meager possessions, hanging her 3 dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her hairbrush and mirror on the dresser. These simple acts of claiming space helped steady her nerves, reminding her that whatever came next, she had survived the worst. The kitchen proved to be a challenge. Months of dust had settled on every surface, and mice had clearly made themselves at home in the pantry. Lillian rolled up her sleeves and set to work, grateful for the physical labor that kept her mind occupied. By evening, she had managed to clean the kitchen thoroughly enough to prepare a simple meal. Samuel returned from tending to the horses just as she was setting the table in the dining room. "Something smells wonderful," he commented, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. He'd washed up, his dark hair still damp at the temples, and changed into a clean shirt. "Just beans and bacon with cornbread," Lillian replied. "Once we stock the pantry properly, I can prepare more varied meals." They ate in companionable silence for a time, the unfamiliarity of sharing a table with a stranger keeping conversation at bay. Finally, Samuel spoke. "I should tell you my plans for the ranch, so you understand what to expect." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "I intend to raise horses' quality stock for both work and racing. I've brought a stallion and 3 mares from Wyoming as foundation stock, and I'll be acquiring more." "Will you have other workers?" Lillian asked, wondering if she would be expected to cook for a bunkhouse full of cowboys. "Eventually," he nodded. "For now, I've hired 2 men who will arrive next week. They'll stay in the bunkhouse and take their meals there, though occasionally they might join us in the house for supper. As the operation grows, I'll need more hands, but that's some months away." Relief washed over Lillian. Cooking for 3 men was manageable. Feeding a crew would have been daunting in her current state of exhaustion. "I notice the garden is overgrown," she ventured. "With some work, it could produce vegetables by summer." Samuel's eyes lit up with interest. "You know gardening, my mother taught me," Lillian explained, surprising herself with the personal revelation. She rarely spoke of her parents. "We had a small plot behind our home in Missouri. It wasn't much, but it kept food on the table." Missouri, Samuel repeated thoughtfully. That's a long way from here. Lillian nodded, her gaze dropping to her plate. My husband Thomas had dreams of finding silver. We came west 5 years ago after my parents passed. She expected questions about Thomas, braced herself for them, but Samuel simply nodded. The garden is yours to manage as you see fit. Whatever seeds or tools you need, just let me know. The conversation shifted to practical matters, the rooms that needed attention first, supplies to be ordered from town, the schedule of meals. By the time they finished eating, Lillian felt more at ease with her new employer, though still wary of the circumstances that had brought her to his home. "I'll wash up," Samuel said, rising from the table and gathering their plates before she could protest. "You've done more than enough for your first day here. Get some rest, Mrs. Matthews." Alone in her room that night, Lillian lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. The wind whispered around the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mates. She thought about Samuel Davenport, his unexpected kindness, his respectful manner, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. Dangerous thoughts for a woman still married, she reminded herself sternly. Thomas might be gone, might never return, but she wore his ring still. And Samuel was her employer, nothing more still. As sleep finally claimed her, Lillian couldn't help but wonder what twist of fate had brought her to this place, and whether it might lead to something beyond mere survival. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that soothed Lillian's battered spirit. Each day brought new progress as the ranch house slowly transformed under her care. Rooms that had been shrouded in dust and grief emerged clean and orderly, windows gleaming in the New Mexico sunshine. Samuel proved to be a considerate employer, never criticizing her work and expressing genuine appreciation for her efforts. He spent most daylight hours outside, working with his horses or making repairs to the outbuildings and fences. Often, Lillian would catch glimpses of him from the windows, his tall figure moving with purpose across the yard, stopping occasionally to gentle a nervous mare or inspect a section of damaged corral. True to his word, 2 ranch hands arrived the following week, brothers named Charlie and Matthew Wilson. They were pleasant young men who kept to themselves mostly, though they showed proper respect to Lillian when their paths crossed. "Mrs. Matthews makes the best biscuits in the territory," Charlie declared one evening when Samuel had invited them to Sunday supper in the main house. Lillian felt herself blush at the praise. "You're too kind, Mr. Wilson. I suspect you're just grateful not to be eating your own cooking anymore." The men laughed, and even Samuel's usually serious expression lightened with amusement. These moments, sharing a meal, hearing laughter in the once silent house, helped ease the lingering unease Lillian felt about her situation. As April turned to May, Lillian tackled the overgrown garden plot behind the house. The soil was surprisingly rich, nourished by years of fallen leaves from the nearby cottonwoods. She spent hours pulling weeds, turning earth, and planting the seeds Samuel had purchased in town: tomatoes, beans, squash, and corn that would provide fresh vegetables through summer and into fall. It was in the garden one warm afternoon that Samuel found her, her hands deep in the soil as she set out onion sets in neat rows. "You've worked miracles here," he commented, surveying the transformed plot. "Just like you have in the house." Lillian sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "It just needed attention, that's all. Things respond when you care for them properly. Indeed they do." Samuel's gaze lingered on her face longer than was strictly proper, then shifted back to the garden. "I've been meaning to ask, there's a social at the church in Columbus this Saturday. Would you like to attend? The Wilson brothers can watch the ranch for the evening." Lillian's heart skipped unexpectedly. "A social, nothing fancy," he assured her. "Just townspeople gathering for music and conversation. I thought you might enjoy an evening away from the ranch." The invitation seemed innocent enough, yet Lillian hesitated. She hadn't been to a social gathering since before Thomas's gambling had isolated them from polite society. The prospect was both appealing and intimidating. "I don't have anything suitable to wear," she said finally, glancing down at her work dress, patched in several places. "There's a dressmaker in town, Mrs. Reynolds. I took the liberty of arranging credit for you there." At her startled look, he added quickly, "Consider it an advance on your wages. You've more than earned it." Lillian's pride warred with practicality. A new dress would be useful for more than just a social, and she couldn't deny the appeal of wearing something that wasn't mended and faded. "Thank you," she said at last. "That's very thoughtful. And yes, I would like to attend the social." Samuel's smile, still rare enough to catch her by surprise, warmed his entire face. "Excellent. We'll go to town early so you can visit Mrs. Reynolds before the event." As he walked away toward the barn, Lillian realized she was smiling too. The garden could wait. Suddenly, she had more pressing matters on her mind. Mrs. Reynolds proved to be a tiny, energetic woman with skilled hands and a sharp eye for measurements. She clucked disapprovingly at Lillian's thin frame, but wisely kept any comments about her circumstances to herself. "Blue," she declared after holding several fabric samples to Lillian's face. "This cornflower blue will bring out your eyes beautifully, Mrs. Matthews." The finished dress, delivered just hours before the social, exceeded Lillian's modest expectations. The blue calico, trimmed with white lace at the collar and cuffs, was the most beautiful garment she'd owned since her wedding dress. Standing before the small mirror in her room, Lillian barely recognized herself. 2 months of regular meals had filled out the hollows in her cheeks, and the blue of the dress did indeed make her eyes appear more vivid. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she removed her wedding ring, placing it in the small wooden box where she kept her mother's locket. It felt strange, almost scandalous to leave it behind, but somehow wrong to wear Thomas's ring to a social with another man, even if that man was only her employer. Samuel waited for her on the porch, dressed in a clean dark suit that transformed him from rancher to gentleman. His eyes widened appreciatively when she appeared. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You look lovely." The drive to Columbus passed quickly, filled with comfortable conversation about the ranch and town gossip Samuel had heard on his last supply run. Lillian found herself laughing at his dry observations about some of the more colorful characters in Columbus. The church was already filled with townspeople when they arrived, lanterns casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A small band played lively tunes in one corner while children darted between groups of conversing adults. Lillian felt eyes turn toward them as they entered, curious, assessing glances that measured and judged. She lifted her chin slightly, determined not to show discomfort. "Mrs. Matthews, what a pleasure to see you." Mr. Patterson approached, his wife on his arm. "And looking so well. The country air must agree with you." "It does, thank you," Lillian replied, grateful for the friendly face. "Mrs. Patterson, it's lovely to meet you." Samuel stood beside her, a steady presence as various townspeople approached to make introductions. Most were welcoming, though Lillian noticed a few women whispering behind their hands as they watched her with Samuel. "Don't mind them," a friendly voice said at her elbow. Lillian turned to find a young woman with curly blonde hair and a kind smile. "I'm Hannah Foster, the schoolteacher. You must be Mrs. Matthews. I've heard Mr. Davenport hired you to manage his household." "Yes, that's right," Lillian confirmed, warming to the woman's straightforward manner. "Well, I'm glad to meet you. We need more sensible women in these parts." Hannah's eyes twinkled with humor. "Especially ones who aren't afraid of haunted ranches." Lillian couldn't help but laugh. "The ghost has been quite well behaved so far." Their conversation was interrupted as the band struck up a lively reel, and couples moved to the cleared space in the center of the room to dance. "Would you care to dance, Mrs. Matthews?" Samuel asked, appearing at her side. Lillian hesitated. Dancing seemed another step beyond the boundaries of an employer-employee relationship, yet she couldn't deny the appeal. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. Samuel's hand at her waist was respectful, maintaining a proper distance between them as they joined the other dancers. He moved with surprising grace for such a tall man, guiding her confidently through the steps of the dance. "You're quite good at this," Lillian remarked, slightly breathless as they turned. "My mother insisted all her sons learn to dance properly," he replied with a hint of a smile. "Said no Davenport would embarrass her by clomping around a dance floor like a draft horse." The image made Lillian laugh, and Samuel's eyes crinkled at the corners in response. "You have a beautiful laugh, Mrs. Matthews. You should use it more often." The compliment caught her off guard, warming her cheeks. "I haven't had much cause for laughter in recent years," she admitted, Samuel's expression sobered. "No, I don't suppose you have." His hand tightened slightly at her waist as he guided her through another turn. "But perhaps that's changing now." The look in his eyes, intent, searching, made Lillian's heart flutter in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She looked away, suddenly aware of how easy it would be to misinterpret the situation, to see more in his kindness than was actually there. "Mr. Davenport," she began carefully, "I'm grateful for all you've done, but—" "Samuel," he interrupted gently. "After 2 months of sharing meals and a household, I think you might call me Samuel, at least when we're not in company." Before Lillian could respond, the music ended and they stopped dancing. Samuel's hand lingered at her waist for a moment before he stepped back, observing the proper distance once more. "Would you like some punch?" he asked, as if the charged moment had never happened. Lillian nodded, grateful for the chance to collect her thoughts. As Samuel moved toward the refreshment table, she found herself approached by Mr. Patterson once more. "Mrs. Matthews, might I have a word?" he asked, his expression unusually serious. "Of course," she replied, following him to a quieter corner of the room. "I don't quite know how to say this," the storekeeper began, looking uncomfortable. "But I thought you should know there's been word from up north. A man fitting your husband's description was killed in a saloon fight in Santa Fe last month." Lillian felt as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. "Thomas, you're certain?" "Not entirely," Patterson admitted. "The man had no identification, but the description matches: red hair, scar on his chin, about 30 years of age, and he was known to be a gambler who'd come down from Columbus Way." The description could indeed be Thomas. The scar on his chin, received in a bar fight 2 years earlier, was distinctive. Lillian's mind whirled with conflicting emotions: grief, shock, and beneath it all, a shameful sense of relief. "Thank you for telling me," she managed. "If you hear anything more definitive—" "Of course," Patterson nodded, patting her arm awkwardly before moving away. Samuel returned with 2 cups of punch, his expression changing instantly as he took in her pale face. "What's wrong? What did Patterson say to upset you?" "Not here," Lillian murmured, aware of curious eyes around them. "Could we step outside for a moment?" The night air was cool after the warmth of the church, stars scattered like diamonds across the New Mexico sky. Lillian took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "Mr. Patterson just informed me that a man matching Thomas's description was killed in Santa Fe," she said, her voice remarkably steady considering the news. It's not confirmed, but the details suggest it might well be him. Samuel's face showed genuine concern. I'm sorry, Lillian. That's difficult news to receive, especially in such a setting. The use of her given name passed unremarked. It seemed natural in the moment. The strange thing is, she confessed, I don't know what I feel. Shouldn't a wife feel devastated at such news? Yet all I can think is that at least now I know. At least there's an end to the wondering. There's no right way to feel, Samuel said quietly, especially given the circumstances of his leaving. Lillian looked up at him sharply. What do you know about that? Only what people in town have mentioned, he admitted. That your husband had gambling debts and disappeared, leaving you in difficult circumstances. I didn't pry for details. She nodded, accepting his explanation. It's true. Thomas loved cards more than anything, more than home, more than me. When he left, he took everything of value except this. She touched her bare finger where the ring had been, then realized she wasn't wearing it. My wedding ring, she clarified. The one I was trying to sell the day we met. Samuel's gaze followed the movement of her hand. I noticed you weren't wearing it tonight. It didn't seem appropriate, Lillian explained, then added more honestly, and perhaps I wanted a night without the weight of that reminder. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of music and laughter from inside the church, a stark contrast to the solemnity of their conversation. Would you prefer to return to the ranch? Samuel asked finally. No one would blame you for wanting privacy after such news. Lillian considered the offer, then shook her head. No, I've had enough of sitting alone with grief and worry. I'd like to stay, if you don't mind, to dance and talk and pretend for one evening that life can be simple and pleasant. The understanding in Samuel's eyes threatened to undo her careful composure. Then that's what we'll do, he said, offering his arm. And tomorrow, if you wish, I can make inquiries in Santa Fe to confirm whether the man was indeed your husband. Lillian placed her hand on his arm, drawing strength from his steadiness. Thank you. They returned to the social, and true to his word, Samuel helped her salvage the evening. They danced several more times, conversed with neighbors, and even joined in when someone started a group singing of familiar hymns and folk songs. If anyone noticed Lillian's occasional distracted look, or the protective way Samuel stayed near her throughout the evening, they were kind enough not to comment. It was well past midnight when they finally headed back to the ranch, the wagon moving steadily through the darkness. Lillian felt exhaustion settling into her bones, not just from the evening's activities, but from the emotional weight of Patterson's news. Samuel, she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. If it is Thomas who died in Santa Fe, what happens to his debts? Samuel considered the question carefully. It depends on the arrangements he made. Some gambling debts die with the man. Others might have been secured against property. The cabin, Lillian murmured, thinking of the small dwelling she'd left behind. Was it in both your names? Samuel asked. No, she admitted. Thomas insisted it be in his name only. He said it was to protect me if anything happened to him, but I think he just didn't want me to have any claim if he needed to sell it. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then if he did die in Santa Fe, the cabin would likely pass to his next of kin parents, siblings, or it might be claimed by creditors, depending on what's recorded at the county office. I see, Lillian sighed, too tired to feel much about the potential loss. The cabin held few happy memories anyway. They completed the journey in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at the ranch, Samuel helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Thank you for this evening, Lillian said, standing in the pool of lantern light beside the porch. Despite the news, I enjoyed myself more than I have in years. As did I, Samuel replied, his voice low in the quiet night. For a moment, she thought he might say more, perhaps even take her hand or step closer. Instead, he merely nodded. "Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Samuel." In her room, Lillian carefully hung the beautiful blue dress in her wardrobe before preparing for bed. As she braided her hair for sleep, her thoughts drifted to the wooden box containing her wedding ring. If Thomas was truly gone, what obligation did she have to keep wearing it? What purpose did it serve? No answers came as she drifted off to sleep, but for the first time, the questions themselves didn't feel like betrayal. The confirmation came 3 weeks later. Samuel had sent telegrams to Santa Fe and finally received a response from the sheriff there. The man killed in the saloon fight had indeed been Thomas Matthews, identified by a letter found sewn into the lining of his coat, addressed to him from a creditor in Columbus. Lillian received the news with a calmness that surprised even herself. 5 years of marriage ended with a telegram. She went through her duties that day as usual, feeding the chickens she'd acquired the previous month, preparing meals, working in the garden that now sprouted green rows of vegetables. Only in the evening, sitting alone on the back porch as the sun set behind the mountains, did she allow herself to truly feel, not grief for Thomas that had come long before his actual death, as she watched the kind man she'd married disappear into an angry, bitter gambler. No, what she felt was grief for the girl she'd been hopeful, trusting, believing in the promise of love and forever. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who understood how easily promises could be broken. The sound of boots on the porch boards alerted her to Samuel's presence. He sat beside her on the bench, not speaking, simply offering companionship as the last light faded from the sky. "I keep thinking I should feel more," Lillian finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That I should weep or rage or something, but all I feel is empty. As if I've been carrying a heavy load for so long that I don't know how to stand straight without it." Samuel nodded, understanding in his silence. "The sheriff's telegram mentioned personal effects," she continued. "A pocket watch, some letters. They're sending them to Columbus, to be held at the post office. We can go tomorrow if you'd like," Samuel offered. Lillian nodded, grateful for his steady presence, for the simplicity of his support. They sat together until the stars emerged, neither feeling the need for further conversation. The next day, they traveled to Columbus together. The package from Santa Fe was small, pitifully so, for the sum of a man's possessions. Lillian accepted it with steady hands and asked Samuel to give her a moment alone. He nodded, saying he had business at the bank and would meet her at the wagon in an hour. Sitting on a bench outside the post office, Lillian opened the package carefully. The pocket watch had been her wedding gift to Thomas Silver, with his initials engraved on the case. It no longer worked, the face cracked and the hands frozen at 3:42. The letters were from various creditors, some threatening, others pleading for payment. At the bottom of the package was a folded piece of paper that made her breath catch, a letter addressed to her in Thomas's uneven handwriting. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. "Lillian, if you're reading this, I'm likely dead or in jail. Either way, I've failed you, as I've failed at most things in life. The debts are too deep now, more than I could ever repay. Some men aren't meant for happiness or stability. I've come to believe I'm one of them. The cabin is lost. I signed it over to Jenkins to cover what I owed him. I'm sorry for that, and for everything else. You deserved better than the hand life dealt you with me." Thomas, no declaration of love, no real regret beyond the material losses, just a final confirmation of what she'd already known. Thomas had never truly loved her, not the way a husband should love a wife. He'd loved the idea of her, a pretty young wife to cook and clean and warm his bed, but not the actual person she was, with dreams and hopes of her own. Lillian carefully folded the letter and returned it to the package. There was nothing more to be gained from Thomas's final words. Whatever closure she might find would have to come from within herself. When she met Samuel at the wagon, he didn't ask about the contents of the package, merely helped her up onto the seat and drove them back toward the ranch. They were halfway home when Lillian finally spoke. "Thomas signed over the cabin to one of his creditors before he left," she said, her voice steady. "I truly have nothing left of my old life now." Samuel glanced at her, then returned his gaze to the road. "Perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing." "No," Lillian agreed after a moment. "Perhaps it's not." That night, she removed her wedding ring for the final time, placing it in the wooden box alongside the package from Santa Fe. Those mementos of her life with Thomas would stay there, not forgotten, but no longer defining who she was or what she might become. As spring turned to summer, the ranch flourished under their combined care. Samuel's horse breeding operation began to show promise, with 2 of his mares in foal and interest from buyers in neighboring territories. The garden produced abundantly, allowing Lillian to preserve vegetables for the coming winter. Their relationship evolved gradually, almost imperceptibly. Conversations over dinner grew longer, more personal. Samuel spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his years working cattle in Wyoming, the dream that had brought him to New Mexico. Lillian shared stories of her parents, her early years in Missouri, her love of books and learning that had been set aside during her marriage. Neither mentioned the growing awareness between them, the way their hands sometimes brushed when passing dishes at dinner, the lingering glances, the easy comfort they found in each other's company. Lillian told herself it was natural, this friendship forming between 2 people who shared a home and worked toward common goals. If her heart quickened when Samuel smiled at her, or if she sometimes found herself watching him from the kitchen window as he worked with the horses well, that was her own private matter. Then came the night of the summer storm, when everything changed. The storm had built throughout the afternoon, dark clouds gathering over the mountains and rolling toward the ranch with alarming speed. By evening, lightning split the sky and thunder shook the windows in their frames. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the yard to mud within minutes. Samuel and the Wilson brothers worked frantically to secure the horses and equipment, while Lillian hurried to close windows and place buckets under the few spots where the roof leaked. She had just finished when the kitchen door burst open, admitting a drenched and mud-splattered Samuel. "The creek's rising fast," he reported, water streaming from his hat and coat. "If it keeps up, it might flood the lower pasture. Charlie and Matthew are moving the horses to higher ground." Lillian immediately began heating water for coffee. "You're soaked through. You'll catch your death if you don't change." Samuel grimaced, looking down at his dripping clothes. "No time. I need to check the barn. Part of the roof was damaged in the last storm. If it caves in, at least take a moment for hot coffee," Lillian insisted, concern overriding her usual deference. "You can't help anyone if you collapse from cold." Something in her tone must have convinced him, for he nodded, stripping off his sodden coat and hat. Lillian busied herself pouring coffee, trying not to notice how his wet shirt clung to the broad planes of his shoulders and chest. "Here," she said, handing him the steaming cup. "Drink this while I find you a dry shirt. There's one in the basket I brought in from the line this morning." Before he could protest, she hurried to retrieve the shirt from her mending pile. When she returned, Samuel had finished the coffee and stood with his back to the stove, steam rising from his wet clothing. "You should change here," Lillian said, practical concerns overriding propriety. "It's warm and you need to get dry before going out again." Samuel hesitated, then nodded. Lillian turned her back discreetly, listening to the rustle of fabric as he stripped off the wet shirt. She shouldn't have been affected by the knowledge of his bare skin just feet away after all. She'd seen shirtless men before. Thomas had never been shy about undressing in front of her. But this was different, charged with an awareness that had nothing to do with practicality. "Decent now," Samuel said, his voice oddly rough. Lillian turned to find him buttoning the dry shirt, his damp hair curling against his neck. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them, acknowledgement of the tension that had been building for months. Thunder crashed directly overhead, making Lillian jump. The lantern on the table flickered, then stabilized. "I should go check the barn," Samuel said, though he made no move toward the door. "Yes," Lillian agreed, equally motionless. Another crack of thunder, and suddenly the space between them vanished. Lillian couldn't have said who moved first, perhaps they both did, but Samuel's arms were around her, and her hands were pressed against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath the dry shirt. "Lillian," he murmured, his voice a question and a plea. She answered by rising on tiptoes, her lips finding his in the dim light of the storm-darkened kitchen. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, then deepened as Samuel's arms tightened around her. Lillian felt herself melting against him, years of loneliness and longing pouring into this one perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Samuel rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the sensation. "I've wanted to do that for months," he confessed. "Since that night at the social, maybe even before." "So have I," Lillian admitted, surprising herself with her boldness. "But I was afraid of what it might mean, afraid it was too soon after Thomas." Samuel's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. And now, before she could answer, the kitchen door burst open again, admitting a soaked and frantic Charlie Wilson. "Boss." The creek's overflowed its bank's waters nearly to the bunkhouse. "Matthew's trying to move the last of the horses, but he needs help." The spell broken, Samuel stepped back from Lillian, though his eyes held a promise of continuation. "I'm coming," he told Charlie, reaching for his still wet coat. "Be careful," Lillian called as they headed back into the storm. "Both of you." Left alone in the kitchen, she pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of Samuel's kiss. Whatever had started between them this night would have to wait. The ranch and the animals needed attention first. But the knowledge that he had wanted her for months, sent a thrill of anticipation through her veins. The storm raged through the night, keeping Samuel and the Wilson brothers outside until dawn broke, revealing the extent of the damage. The creek had indeed flooded, washing away part of the lower pasture fence and flooding the root cellar, though fortunately the house stood on high enough ground to escape harm. Exhausted from their night-long battle against the elements, the men returned to find Lillian had prepared a hearty breakfast. They ate ravenously. Then the Wilson brothers retreated to the bunkhouse to catch a few hours of sleep before tackling repairs. Samuel lingered at the table, fatigue etched in the lines of his face. "You should rest," Lillian told him gently. "Everything else can wait." He nodded, too tired to argue, but caught her hand as she cleared his plate. "We need to talk," he said softly, "about what happened before the storm interrupted." Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Yes, we do, but after you've slept." He brushed his thumb across her knuckles, the simple touch sending sparks along her skin. "Promise you won't regret it while I'm sleeping. Promise you'll still be here when I wake up." "Where else would I go?" she asked with a small smile. "This is my home now, too." The words seemed to satisfy him, for he nodded and released her hand, making his way to his bedroom down the hall. Lillian watched him go, her heart full of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope, desire, the fluttering beginnings of something that might, with care, grow into love. She spent the morning assessing storm damage and salvaging what she could from the flooded root cellar. The physical labor helped calm her racing thoughts, giving her time to examine her feelings about the previous night's events. Thomas had been gone for months, dead for weeks. She had mourned not his death but the death of their marriage long before that. Was it wrong to find comfort, even happiness, with another man so soon? Society might say yes, but Lillian found she cared less for society's opinions than she once had. Life on the frontier taught hard lessons about survival and seizing chances when they appeared. And Samuel. He was nothing like Thomas. Where Thomas had been charming but unreliable, Samuel was steady and true to his word. Where Thomas had taken and taken until nothing remained, Samuel gave not just material comforts but respect, kindness, the dignity of meaningful work and fair compensation. By the time Samuel emerged from his room in the late afternoon, Lillian had made her decision. Whatever was growing between them, she would not turn away from it out of fear or misplaced loyalty to a man who had abandoned her. They spoke that evening after supper, sitting on the front porch as the last light faded from the sky. The air was fresh after the storm, filled with the scent of wet earth and new growth. "I meant what I said last night," Samuel began, his voice quiet but certain. "I've had feelings for you for some time now, but I understand if it's too soon or if you don't share those feelings." Lillian looked out at the land stretching before them, the ranch that had become her sanctuary, her second chance. "When we first met," she said slowly, "when you told me to keep my ring because I'd need hope more than bread, I thought you were just being kind. I didn't realize then that you were offering me both sustenance and hope." She turned to face him, gathering her courage. "I do share your feelings, Samuel. What I felt for Thomas died long before he did. Being here with you, I've found parts of myself I thought were lost forever." Samuel reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. "I don't want to rush you, Lillian. We have time." "Time," she repeated with a small smile. "That's another gift you've given me, the luxury of time to heal, to discover who I am beyond Thomas's wife or the widow Matthews." "And who are you discovering yourself to be?" Samuel asked, genuine interest in his eyes. Lillian considered the question. "Someone stronger than I knew, someone who loves growing things and bringing order to chaos, someone who might, given the chance, be capable of loving again, not out of desperation or loneliness, but out of choice and joy." Samuel's grip on her hand tightened. "I would very much like to be the recipient of that love when you're ready to give it." The simplicity of his declaration, the absence of flowery promises or grand gestures, touched Lillian deeply. This was real, a man who saw her clearly and valued what he saw. "I think," she said softly, "that I might be closer to ready than I realized." Their second kiss was unhurried, a gentle exploration rather than the storm-fueled passion of the night before. When they parted, Lillian felt a sense of peace settle over her, as if pieces long scattered had finally fallen into place. The days that followed took on a new sweetness, a sense of possibility that infused even the most mundane tasks with meaning. They moved slowly, deliberately, building a foundation of trust and mutual respect that went beyond their initial employer-employee relationship. Samuel formally relieved Lillian of her duties as housekeeper, insisting that she was now a partner in the ranch's operations rather than a servant. Though she still managed the household and garden tasks, she genuinely enjoyed. He made it clear that her contributions were valued equally with his own. On a trip to Columbus in late August, Samuel surprised her by stopping the wagon at the county clerk's office. "There's something I need to do," he explained, helping her down. "Would you come with me?" Inside, he requested a deed modification form, filling it out while Lillian watched in confusion. When he slid the completed document across the desk to the clerk, she glimpsed what he'd written and gasped softly. "Samuel, you can't." "I can," he said firmly. "And I am. The ranch is now in both our names, Lillian, equal partners in every sense." The clerk stamped the document and made the appropriate entries in his ledger, then handed Samuel a copy of the deed showing both their names. Samuel Davenport and Lillian Matthews, joint owners of the Cottonwood Creek Ranch. Outside, Lillian confronted him, struggling to find words adequate to her tumultuous emotions. "Why would you do this? The ranch is your dream, your investment." Samuel took her hands in his expression serious. "Because I want you to know that you have a home that can never be taken from you. Because I want you to feel secure in a way you haven't before. And because," he added with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, "I hope someday soon you might agree to change the second name on that deed from Matthews to Davenport." Lillian's heart stuttered in her chest. "Samuel, are you asking what I think you're asking?" "Not officially," he clarified. "Not yet. That will come with a proper ring and on bended knee when the time is right. But yes, Lillian, I am telling you that I love you and that I hope to make you my wife when you're ready." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, not the tears of sorrow she'd grown accustomed to, but tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so unexpected it almost hurt. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both foreign and completely right on her tongue. Samuel's face lit with a smile more brilliant than any she'd yet seen from him. He drew her into his arms right there on the main street of Columbus, not caring who might see or what they might think. "Then we have all we need," he murmured against her hair. "The rest is just details." The details, as it happened, fell into place with surprising ease. By early October, with the first frost silvering the meadows each morning, Lillian felt ready to take the final step. Her period of mourning more for the marriage than the man had been unconventional but genuine. She had made peace with her past and looked toward the future with clear eyes. On a crisp Sunday morning, they rode into Columbus for church services, Lillian wearing a new dress of deep green wool that Samuel had insisted on ordering from back east. After the service, Reverend Taylor performed a simple ceremony in the same church where they had danced months before. Hannah Foster served as Lillian's witness, while Charlie Wilson stood up for Samuel. The congregation, many of whom had watched with interest as the relationship between the rancher and his housekeeper evolved, offered genuine congratulations. If some had gossiped earlier about the propriety of their living arrangement, all such concerns were laid to rest by the obvious devotion they showed each other. "Mrs. Davenport," Samuel said as they drove back to the ranch, testing the sound of her new name. "It suits you." Lillian leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "More than Matthews ever did," she agreed. That night, as they stood in the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "I have something for you," he said, suddenly looking almost shy. "A wedding gift." From the pouch he produced a ring, not an elaborate affair with diamonds or precious stones, but a simple band of gold set with a small pearl. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed as he slipped it onto her finger. "Perfect. There's an inscription," Samuel told her, his voice husky with emotion. "Inside the band." Lillian removed the ring to read the tiny words engraved within, hope and love entwined. "The first day we met," Samuel explained. "When you tried to sell your wedding ring for bread, I told you to keep it, that you'd need hope. I didn't know then that I was already falling in love with you, the way you held your head high despite your circumstances, the quiet dignity you maintained. I just knew I couldn't bear to see you part with something that mattered to you." Lillian slipped the ring back onto her finger where it caught the lamplight and gleamed. "You gave me hope that day," she said softly, "and every day since. Now you've given me love as well." "And you've given me the same," Samuel replied, drawing her into his arms. "A reason to build something lasting, someone to share it with." As his lips found hers in the golden light of their bedroom, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that the journey that had begun with hunger and desperation had led her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of a man who valued hope as much as bread, and love above all. The years that followed were not without challenges. Droughts threatened their crops, economic downturns affected horse prices, and the harsh realities of frontier life tested their resilience. But the foundation they had built proved strong enough to weather every storm. Samuel's breeding program flourished, producing horses known throughout the territory for their strength and intelligence. Lillian's garden expanded to include not just vegetables but flowers and herbs, transforming the once bare yard into an oasis of color and fragrance. In the spring of their second year of marriage, they welcomed a son, William Thomas Davenport, named for both their fathers. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, Elizabeth Hannah, called Betsy, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes. The ghost of the Miller place, if it had ever truly existed, seemed content with the new life that filled the old ranch house. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and Lillian and Samuel sat on the porch watching the sunset, she would think about the strange twists of fate that had brought her there, how the darkest moment of her life, standing in Patterson's store trying to sell her wedding ring for bread, had led to her greatest happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel would ask, noticing her contemplative mood, and Lillian would smile, touching the pearl ring that never left her finger. "About hope," she would answer, "and how sometimes it comes in forms we least expect." On William's 5th birthday, a package arrived from Columbus, the wooden box Lillian had left with Hannah Foster for safekeeping years before. Inside were the remnants of her first marriage: Thomas's letters, his broken pocket watch, and the plain gold wedding band she'd nearly sold that fateful day. "What will you do with it?" Samuel asked as they sat at the kitchen table, the box open between them, their sleeping children safely tucked in upstairs. Lillian considered the items thoughtfully. Once, they had represented all she had left in the world. Now, they were simply relics of a past that had shaped but no longer defined her. "I'll keep them for William," she decided. "When he's older, I'll tell him about Thomas, not just the gambling and the abandonment, but the young man I married who had dreams and hopes of his own before life's disappointments hardened him. Our children should know where they come from, the full truth of it." Samuel nodded, understanding as always. "And the ring?" Lillian picked up the plain gold band, feeling its familiar weight one last time. "The ring I'll keep as a reminder," she said softly. "Not of Thomas, but of the day a kind cowboy told me I needed hope more than bread, and then proceeded to give me both." Samuel reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb brushing over the pearl ring that had replaced the gold band. "I thank God every day that I walked into Patterson's store at that exact moment," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That I found you when I wasn't even looking." "Perhaps we found each other," Lillian suggested, entwining her fingers with his. Two people who had learned the value of hope and weren't afraid to offer it to someone else. As they prepared for bed that night, Lillian placed the wooden box on a high shelf in their wardrobe, accessible but not central to their daily lives. The past had its place, honored but not revered. The future, with its promise of continued joy and inevitable challenges, beckoned more brightly. Later, lying in Samuel's arms in the darkness, Lillian listened to the familiar sounds of their home, the children's soft breathing from across the hall, the occasional creak of the house settling, the distant howl of a coyote across the valley. Sounds that had once seemed foreign now represented security and belonging. "I love you, Samuel Davenport," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "Thank you for giving me a life I never dared to imagine." His arms tightened around her, his lips finding hers in the darkness. "I love you too, Lillian Davenport. Thank you for being brave enough to take a chance on a stranger who couldn't bear to see you sell your wedding ring for bread." And as they drifted toward sleep, wrapped in each other's warmth, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that hope had indeed proven more valuable than bread in the long run, though having both, along with love, made for the sweetest life of all.